Brothers and sisters, listen carefully. They tried to handcuff my voice with paper, 12 pages, written by strangers, signed by no one. A script of surrender, an apology dressed up as diplomacy. They told me, read it, President Traoré. Don't resist. This is how you keep partnerships. This is how you survive. But I was not sent to the United Nations to read their words. I was not chosen by my people to bow in silence. I did not come to apologize for speaking the truth. About Israel, about France, about the invisible war strangling Africa. I came to represent a people silenced for over 400 years. And no piece of paper, no foreign power, no threat of isolation will ever change that. So, I folded their script in half. And when I stepped up to that microphone, I brought my own words. Words that shook the chamber. It all started with my speech 2 months ago, the one they said went too far. In it, I called out what Israel and its allies were doing in Gaza. I said that the cries of Palestinian mothers echoed just like the cries of mothers in Mali and Congo and Niger. I said that if Africa remained silent, then we were complicit. That speech didn't sit well with the so-called peacekeepers. A week later, I received an official letter from the UN Secretary General's office. It said my remarks had caused diplomatic tension and undermined regional cooperation. They asked me to appear before the assembly, not to speak freely, but to clarify my position. Let me be clear, they didn't want a clarification. They wanted a confession, and they didn't stop there. Calls came in from Paris, from Washington, from Tel Aviv. Back channels were activated. Offers were made. Threats followed. We can reconsider development aid if you're willing to walk it back. We understand your position, but surely you don't want sanctions. Then, the final blow. They drafted a speech for me, 4 pages, apologizing for tone, 3 pages, apologizing for language, and 5 pages reminding me to reaffirm our shared values. Whose values? Because the last time I checked, our values didn't include silence in the face of genocide. I could have stayed home. I could have ignored the invitation. But I knew what this moment meant. If I didn't speak, they'd rewrite the story. If I didn't show up, they'd say I backed down. So I flew to New York with no script, no apology, and no intention of bowing. But before I tell you what happened in that chamber, let me tell you about the week leading up to it. Because that's when I discovered just how deep their panic really went. 3 days after I received their drafted apology, my phone rang at 2 a.m. Not my official line, my personal phone, the one that only 5 people in the world have access to. A voice I didn't recognize said, "President Traoré, this is Ambassador Richardson from the US State Department. We need to talk." 20 minutes later, a Seat black SUV pulled up to the presidential palace. No flags, no diplomatic plates, no advance notice. Ambassador Richardson stepped out with 2 men who never introduced themselves. "Mr. President," he said, settling into my office without invitation, "we have a problem." He opened a leather briefcase and spread documents across my desk. Satellite photos of Burkina Faso's gold mines. Financial records of our newly negotiated Chinese infrastructure deals. Intelligence reports on Russian military advisors we'd never officially announced. "We know everything," he said quietly, "and right now we're choosing to call it economic cooperation instead of what it really island." I leaned back in my chair. "And what do you think it really is, Ambassador? The beginning of something that could make your country very uncomfortable." He wasn't wrong. For 6 months, we'd been quietly restructuring every major international partnership. Chinese engineers were redesigning our telecommunications network. Russian agricultural experts were revolutionizing our farming techniques. Iranian pharmaceutical companies were building medical facilities that would make us self-sufficient in basic healthcare. Not because we hated the West, but because we'd learned that dependency is just slavery with better marketing. Richardson continued, "That speech you're planning to give at the UN, it doesn't have to be confrontational. You can make your point while keeping your partnerships intact." I looked at him for a long moment. "Ambassador, let me ask you something. When your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize to the UN first? That's different. When France intervened in Mali, did they ask African permission? The situations aren't comparable. When Israel bombs Palestinian schools, do they draft apology speeches?" Richardson closed his briefcase. "President Traoré, you're a smart man. I hope you'll make the smart choice." After they left, I called my security chief. "How many Western intelligence operatives do we currently have under surveillance in Ouagadougou?" 17 confirmed. "Probably double that number we haven't identified yet." "And how many of our phone lines are they monitoring?" "All of them. But we've been feeding them false information for 3 months." I smiled. "Good. Tomorrow, I want you to leak a story that I'm having second thoughts about the UN speech. What kind of second thoughts? The kind that suggest I might actually read their apology. My security chief grinned. Understood, Mr. President. Because here's what Richardson and his masters didn't understand. I wasn't just planning to reject their script. I was planning to expose why they'd written it in the first place. The next morning, Western embassies across Africa began receiving reports that President Traore was reconsidering his approach and seeking ways to rebuild diplomatic relationships. CNN ran a story titled, "Burkina Faso leader may soften stance." The BBC quoted diplomatic sources saying, "I was open to compromise." And in Washington, State Department officials were telling each other that their pressure campaign was working. They had no idea they were being played because, while they were celebrating their supposed victory, I was in Ouagadougou's Revolution Square speaking to 50,000 Burkinabé who had gathered to hear what I really planned to say in New York. "They think we will apologize," I told the crowd. "They think Africa is still the continent that begs for permission to speak." The roar that went up could be heard for miles. But I want you to know something. When I stand before the United Nations, I won't be representing just Burkina Faso. I'll be representing every African who was told to be grateful for crumbs. Old women were crying, young men were chanting. Children who didn't fully understand the politics could still feel the electricity in the air. They can freeze our aid. They can impose their sanctions. They can write all the apology speeches they want, but they cannot make us kneel. That evening, I received a call from President Kagame of Rwanda. "Brother," he said, "I heard about your UN appearance. Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" "Paul," I replied, "we've been preparing for what comes next our entire lives. The question is whether we're finally ready to stop being afraid of it." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "Nothing. Just remember this conversation when they try to isolate us. Remember that we chose dignity over comfort." 2 days later, I was on a plane to New York. My foreign minister tried one last time to convince me to soften the message. "Mr. President, we could acknowledge their concerns while still maintaining our position." I looked out the airplane window at the Atlantic Ocean below. "Minister, do you know why they're so desperate for an apology? To maintain diplomatic relationships? Number. Because apologies create precedent. If I apologize for telling the truth about Gaza, then every other African leader learns that truth is negotiable. If I apologize for calling out French interference, then interference becomes acceptable. If I apologize for demanding dignity, then dignity becomes optional." I turned to face him. "This isn't about me. This is about establishing that Africa will no longer apologize for refusing to be victimized." When we landed at JFK Airport, something unexpected was waiting for us. Protesters, not against us, for us. 200 Africans living in New York had somehow learned about my arrival. They held signs reading, "Africa doesn't apologize and Traoré speaks for us." As my motorcade passed, I rolled down the window. A young woman, probably university-aged, ran alongside the car shouting, "Make them hear us, President! Make them hear us!" That's when I knew this wasn't just about one speech anymore. This was about something much larger. I walked into that chamber and the air was thick. Delegates from over 100 nations. All eyes on the young man from Burkina Faso. The one they said was too bold, too loud, too African. Some were smirking. Others didn't even look up. But I found my microphone, adjusted it once, and began. I didn't waste time. "Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times have you apologized for what you've done to Africa?" Silence. "Did Belgium ever apologize for what it did in the Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region?" I saw the cameras zoom in. I saw the delegates shift uncomfortably. Then I continued. "You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth. But when the bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When thousands of African children starve because of your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic." Every word was intentional, every pause calculated. I reminded them that Africa was no longer afraid, that we didn't need permission to defend our dignity. The West speaks of peace while exporting war. The West speaks of democracy while supporting coups. The West speaks of aid but delivers debt. At one point, the French delegate stood up and walked out. Good, let him walk. Because this wasn't just a speech, this was a reckoning. But then I did something they weren't expecting. I pulled out my phone, right there at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. "I want to read you something," I said. "A message I received this morning from a 1-2-year-old girl in Ouagadougou." The chamber was dead silent. She wrote, "Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African." I looked up from the phone. That child has more dignity than this entire assembly. I could see security guards shifting nervously. This wasn't in anyone's script. You want to know what I'm going to apologize for? I'll apologize for one thing. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand in this chamber and speak without fear. The tension was electric. I apologize that my predecessors felt they had to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that African children grew up believing they needed Western approval to dream big. I apologize that we ever convinced ourselves that partnership meant subordination. By now, even the note-takers had stopped writing. But I will not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for rejecting partnerships that leave my people in poverty. I will not apologize for being African and proud. I looked them in the eye and said, "And if that makes you uncomfortable, then you're finally understanding how we felt for centuries." The chamber was stunned. Not a single clap, not a single interruption. But I didn't need applause. I needed them to hear me, and they did. Because 3 hours after my speech ended, something unprecedented happened. The African Union called an emergency session. 43 African ambassadors gathered in a conference room at the Ethiopian mission to the UN. For the first time in decades, they weren't discussing aid packages or trade agreements. They were discussing revolution, not the kind with guns and coups, the kind with dignity and determination. By midnight, they had drafted the New York Declaration, a commitment that no African nation would accept conditional aid, apologize for defending sovereignty, or allow foreign powers to dictate domestic policy. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had signed it. But the real earthquake wasn't happening in government buildings. It was happening in the streets. In Nairobi, university students organized Dignity Day, a campus-wide teach-in about African self-determination. In Lagos, market women began refusing to sell products from companies that supported Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians wrote songs sampling excerpts from my UN speech. In Cape Town, artists painted murals showing African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela to me with the caption, "The Unbroken Chain." The next morning, the headline screamed, "Burkina Faso's Traore on defying the West." African leader refuses to apologize. Traore's fiery speech stuns global diplomats. They couldn't believe I had done it. They thought I'd be tame, calculated, careful. Instead, I was everything they fear in an African leader. Unscripted, unbought, unapologetic. Within 24 hours, the retaliation began. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds. The IMF postponed a debt relief review. French media launched a smear campaign, labeling me a dictator in disguise. One American think tank even tweeted, "Burkina Faso risks isolation unless its leader learns the art of diplomacy." But I had already told my people we are not here to beg. What they call